Okay, Ed Gordon. Ed Gordon, as many of you know him pretty well. He's a historian, a speaker, a researcher, and author. He's taught history at DePaul University in Chicago and was a distinguished lecturer for the Organization of American Historians for 10 years. He has presented hundreds of historical programs across America to museums, libraries, universities, historical societies, professional groups, trade associations, alumni organizations, and community groups, and of course to the Cliff Dwellers on many occasions. Ed is also the president and founder of Imperial Consulting Corporation. His latest book, Divided on D-Day, How Conflicts and Rivalries Jeopardized the Allied Victory at Normandy, which was co-authored with David Ramsey, was published by Prometheus Books. Dr. Gordon earned his BA and MA degrees in history at DePaul University and his PhD at Loyola University Chicago. He also pursued postgraduate studies at the University of Chicago, and he's been a literary member of the Cliff Dwellers since 2000. Ed, take it away. Ed, I'm not hearing you.
All right.
Oh, there you are. That's better.
Do I hit P down here?
There.
There we go.
There you go.
All right. So welcome everyone to Fireball in the Night. This is the 75th anniversary of the firebombing of Japan and also the explosion of the first two atomic bombs on August 6th and August 9th of 1945. Well, after December 7th, 1941, for 6 months, Japan raged across the Pacific and carved out a major empire. Here is a map of their conquests. But soon we had defeated their navy at the Battle of Midway in June of 1942 and sunk 4 of the Japanese major aircraft carriers. That fall, we landed on Guadalcanal and started the long march up the chain of islands that would end in the bombing of Japan, the projected invasion, and the dropping of the atomic bomb. Tonight, we'll look at first an ineffective effort in 1944, and then when LeMay took command, how he switched to firebombing and the results of that bombing. The Japanese would not surrender, and we're going to review in detail the tremendous defensive measures that the Japanese took to prevent a successful invasion of their island. Then we'll take a detailed look at the development of the atomic bomb and the controversy of whether or not to drop it on Japan. The emperor and his cabinet then wrestled with the idea of whether they should surrender or not. A coup was attempted in August to prevent the emperor and Japan from surrendering. The surrender itself was a very moving ceremony, particularly when I give you the background of the man who signed the surrender documents for the Japanese. And then, of course, Japan was reborn and became a major economic power, and with its constitution, outlawed war. Finally, we will look at whether or not the atomic bomb should have been used or we should have launched the invasion. Well, after Guadalcanal fell, as you see, the U.S. worked its way across the Southwest Pacific under MacArthur and the Central Pacific under Nimitz until they had reached the Mariana Islands, where Guam, Tinian, and Saipan are located. You can see a map of the central area of Japan itself. And now from those islands is 1,500 air miles to Japan itself. The United States developed a long-range bomber, there it is, the B-29, to fly that distance from 6 airfields. The bomber itself was revolutionary. It was by far the largest aircraft of the Second World War. It was almost 100 feet in length and 27 feet high. Its wingspan was 141 feet. It could operate at 38,000 feet and at an airspeed of 350 miles an hour, which was phenomenal for a bomber. And it could fly 3,500 miles with 4 tons of bombs. This was the machine that would, in the end, deliver the knockout punch to Japan. As a side note, those engines you see on that plane were built here in Chicago in the largest plant operated during World War II. It covered a square mile. Where Midway Airport is today was that plant that built those engines. 40,000 people worked at that plant building the B-29 bomber engines. Well, at first, in November and December, high-altitude precision bombing was attempted. The difficulty was the bombing from that high altitude, the winds would cause the bombs to drift, and so it was largely ineffective and caused very little damage. As a result, this man, Curtis LeMay, was taken from Europe, where he had been quite effective in guiding the U.S. bombing, and moved to Japan in late December of 1944. LeMay had gotten spectacular results in Europe, and now he would switch tactics to low-level bombing, wide area bombing, and he'd use incendiary bombs. Well, why incendiary bombs? Well, here's Tokyo, but this is the modern part of Tokyo. Most of Tokyo at that time was constructed out of wood and paper, which made it highly inflammable. So on March 9th and 10th of 1945, the first attack was made on the city. The B-29s released 609,000 pounds of napalm bombs in the first hour at 5,000 to 8,000 feet. The biggest problem for the bombers was the tremendous turbulence that bombing caused and bounced them all over the sky. They had debris, window frames, etc., bouncing up to their level and hitting the aircraft. This is the result. It was by far the most violent night in the entire Second World War. 250,000 buildings were destroyed. 130,000 Japanese died, and many more were injured. 15 square miles of Tokyo, as you see, were obliterated by a massive firestorm. The U.S. lost 14 bombers and 140 men. Now, many more raids occurred in April and May, and an additional 11 miles of Tokyo were destroyed. So by August of 1945, 1 million of the 1.6 million buildings in Tokyo had been wiped out. 250 square miles of the city was totally devastated. From March to August of 1945, 64 additional Japanese cities were basically leveled to the ground by firebombing, including Kobe, Osaka, and Yokohama. 67 cities in the end were basically wiped out, 180 square miles of urban Japan. By July of 45, half of Tokyo had burned to the ground. 300,000 Japanese civilians died in the bombing. 20% of the housing of Japan was destroyed. 15 million Japanese were left homeless. Well, what was the Japanese response to this terrible, terrible attack? Well, they built a new fighter, the Tony, the Ki-6. It has a speed of 366 miles per hour and a ceiling of 33,000 feet. Well, that should have taken care of our bombers. Well, not quite. We brought out the P-51, the Mustang Escort. Not only did it turn around the air war against the Luftwaffe in Europe and shoot down the Messerschmitts, in Japan, it wiped out the Tony because the Mustang could fly at 445 miles an hour and could go up a ceiling of almost 42,000 feet. We shot down droves of their planes. They became desperate. They found the best defense was ramming, kamikaze ramming attack on the B-29 bombers. You see in this photo, one of their fighters roaring in at a low level. And the last ramming occurred in June of 1945. So the question is often asked, why the specific Tokyo raids in March 10th and the other cities were so effective? Well, we had done it in Hamburg, and we later did it in Dresden. And the reason in Japan it was effective, most importantly, was so many of the buildings were very lightly constructed. Nature's reinforced man's handiwork with what the Japanese called the akaze, the red wind. This was a hurricane force wind. It caused a firestorm. Same thing occurred in Hamburg, Germany, and in Dresden. The wind drove temperatures up to 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. Superheated vapors advanced ahead of the flames, killing and incapacitating their victims. The mechanisms of death were multiple: oxygen deficiency, carbon monoxide poisoning, radiant heat, direct flames, and of course, the trampling feet of stampeding, frightened crowds that caused death. These same conditions occurred across Europe. Well, here is what happened. It left Japan in ruins, and here are the results. Japan's aerial defenses also were simply too few. Too few planes, too few anti-aircraft guns, too few air raid shelters, and too little fire equipment. On the American side, 136 B-29s were lost during these raids, shot down. However, an additional 30,000 Air Force personnel were rescued, principally because they could crash land on or near Iwo Jima. Iwo Jima had became a lifeboat. We had taken Iwo Jima, a small island rock in the Pacific near Japan, considered part of Japan, at great cost. Many Marines had died in that battle. 26,000 Japanese died taking Iwo Jima, or were defending Iwo Jima. However, 30,000 of our airmen were saved because they could crash land near or on Iwo Jima itself. In July 1945, the U.S. blanketed the few remaining Japanese cities with this message: appeal to the people, it said. As you know, America stands for humanity and does not wish to injure innocent civilians, so you had better evacuate your cities. Some did, many did not. Between January and July of 1945, the U.S. firebombed and destroyed all but 5 Japanese cities, sparing Kyoto, the ancient imperial capital, and 4 others. Well, what was the Japanese response to this terrific pounding? No surrender. Instead, Japan would be turned into a fortress. Here in the middle is General Tojo, the man who ordered the Pearl Harbor attack, and his cabinet. He remained in power until July of 1944, until Saipan fell. Here now is the new cabinet that was installed, and some of these ministers actually wanted to surrender, but most still wanted to continue the war. The chief obstacle to surrender was the unconditional surrender terms that we had laid on Japan as we had laid on Germany. This meant that the Japanese felt that the emperor would not be protected. They feared that the emperor would be charged as a war criminal. This fear made the Japanese fight even harder, hoping that the higher US casualties might help them to get better terms of surrender. So what did the Japanese do to prepare for the invasion of their homeland? Operation Kitsugo, decisive battle. First, there is the size of the army and the paramilitary, over 6 million men. Air Force, 10,000 kamikaze aircraft with the fuel necessary for them to crash into US ships. 3,000 conventional aircraft still available with the fuel needed to bomb. And these aircraft were concealed at 200 takeoff strips and airfields that were hidden, and 24 seaplane bases. The Japanese had a very small number of ships left. Most had been destroyed, but they had midget submarines and 5,000 suicide crafts they intended to use to smash into the invasion fleet. They hoped to destroy at least 40% of the invasion fleet with these forces. Floating bombs were deployed from 98 secret bases around Japan to save food and release prison guards from frontline duty. All the POWs, about 94,000 Americans and British, would be shot, hanged, and burned the minute we landed on Japan. The Japanese in Manchuria had weapons of mass destruction. They had 100,000 tons of material that would kill half of the people on Earth if they were deployed. Now, the Japanese had deployed floating bombs to cause tremendous destruction of wildfires, forest fires in the Pacific Northwest. The United States 555th Parachute Infantry Battalion fought 300 fires in the Pacific Northwest, putting out the fires that the incendiary bombs had caused. One of them actually landed near a nuclear plant, as you'll see the map that I'll show you shortly, that was developing the bomb. And if it had reached there, there would have been a tremendous explosion. What has been learned recently is the Japanese also deployed in the Japanese airstream across the Northern Pacific thousands of balloons with botulism. If the botulism had successfully landed in the United States, it would have caused a plague across the Northwest and across the United States. Tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of Americans would have died. Luckily, the balloons flew at such a high altitude that the poison froze, and the bacilli was rendered harmless when it crashed into the Pacific Northwest. The invasion beaches had interlocking camouflage fire and had poison gas pipes buried under all of the principal landing sites, which they would be using. By the summer of 1945, Emperor Hirohito, pictured here, wanted peace for a number of reasons. First, the cities had been destroyed. Second, we had sunk their merchant marine. Japan had to import most of its food. The civilians were starving. Third, there was such a loss of faith in the military because until the firebombing began, the Japanese still were reporting great victories, how they were winning the war. Of course, later the atomic bomb blasts convinced Hirohito to surrender. Finally, though, he and others had a fear of a civilian uprising over the rapid deteriorating conditions, the bombing and the starvation. Here are people waiting in line for their meager food rationings. However, the military persisted. They received from the Germans information on how to build an atomic bomb. Here are students digging for uranium in Japan. Many of them would die from radiation poisoning. Go back one more. Oh, here. Invasion plan. The Allied plan for the invasion would be met also by a whirlwind Japanese counterattack. Hourly waves of 300 to 400 kamikaze aircraft would strike. The goal was to sink 30 to 40% of the 5,000 ships of the fleet. Inland, critical hill networks of tunnels, deep underground rooms, command posts, food, ammunition storage, and freshwater wells, similar to the defenses that had caused massive casualties on Iwo Jima and Okinawa. The Japanese built all of this. The Japanese defense goal were ferocious attacks aimed at killing as high a number of Americans as possible to force a negotiated peace that would be favorable to Japan. Their goal was to fight to the last ditch. Then, in that ditch, 2 million civilians were armed to fight to the death. 81,000 rifles, 120,000 bayonets, pipe guns, crossbows, bazookas, automatic weapons were distributed to the civilian population. Well, here's a map of our plan to invade Japan. Operation Downfall. First, we would operate at sea and blockade Japan, and then we'd use intensive air bombardment and destroy all of Japan's naval and air strength and obviously devastate its cities. The operation on the mainland would be divided into several phases. First, Kyushu would be taken, then Honshu, and the Tokyo plan would be overrun. The date for the first invasion was November 1st, 1945, Operation Olympic. 650,000 American ground troops would be deployed for that first invasion. This would be followed by Operation Coronet in March of 1946 that would invade the island of Honshu. Army and Navy planners suspected that the conquest of Japan would be bloody beyond comparison, far bloodier than any other campaign in the Pacific. The Army felt that the invasion would be far more difficult and dangerous with higher casualties than the Normandy invasion. Here are the projected estimated casualties among Allied and Japanese. I want you to take a good look at those numbers. 1.7 to 4 million, all those POWs killed, and 5 to 10 million Japanese dead. The Chief of Staff, General Marshall, warned that war weariness in the United States demanded the return home of the brave men who had fought in Europe, regardless of the effect of the return on the persecution of the Japanese War. Some military officials wondered whether Japan might somehow be induced to surrender beforehand. Enter the bomb. In October of 1939, the world-renowned scientist Albert Einstein wrote a letter to President Roosevelt. A very reluctant Roosevelt had read the letter, but Einstein warned him that the Germans were already working on an atomic bomb. It was presented by Alexander Sachs, the director of the Lehman Corporation. He told Roosevelt a story about how Fulton had come to talk to Napoleon about using steamboats to transport French troops across the English Channel. And Napoleon threw him out and said he was an idiot. Now, if Napoleon had listened to the inventor, the course of European history probably would have been changed. Roosevelt got the point, and he said, all right, this requires action. Well, the action took 2 more years, and it also took the attack of the Japanese on Pearl Harbor before he expedited and set up a budget to fund the Manhattan Project, to build the bomb. Here is the picture of the 2 main characters of that drama. General Groves on the right, who had just finished building the Pentagon, that for many years is the largest office building in the world, and Robert Oppenheimer, the genius nuclear physicist, who would guide the other physicists from around the world to build the atomic bomb. The Manhattan Project was vast. Here are all the sites it occurred at, including here in Chicago. $600,000 people across the United States would work on the bomb. The cost in today's dollars was $40 billion. Now, I want you also to realize, though, that the cost of building the airfields and support bases in the Southern Pacific that supported the Pacific War by the Seabees exceeded the cost of the Manhattan Project. Now, the first chain reaction was here in Chicago. Enrico Fermi supervised this self-sustaining chain reaction at the University of Chicago. Several thousand people at the University of Chicago worked on that project. And there's a memorial to that chain reaction on a campus of the University of Chicago. Here's a picture of the women at Oak Ridge, Tennessee. Their task was to pry the fissionable U-235 from U-238, the predominant isotope in natural uranium. Churchill and Roosevelt. As early as September of 1944, these men agreed to use the atomic bomb first against the Japanese. They made the decision. The first 2 bombs were to be named Fat Man after Churchill, and at first, Thin Man changed the little boy for Roosevelt. Now we speed forward. June 1945, President Truman has become the President of the United States upon the death of Roosevelt. He knew nothing about the atomic bomb when he became president. They were looking at the appalling numbers to the invasion. And Truman asked his Assistant Secretary of War, John McCloy, what he thought. And he said invading Japan, he thought, was fantastic. the casualties would be too high. The secretary asked him, well, why not use the atomic bomb? Well, there was the first big problem with that is they didn't know if they had an atomic bomb that would work. So the dialogue broke down as to what would happen. Well, here in this remote place in Los Alamos, New Mexico, Oppenheimer was trying to do just that and make a working bomb. Los Alamos, there he assembled a stellar team of the world's leading physicists, many who had fled Europe because of Nazi oppression, Jews and non-Jews. There they worked to assemble and produce the first atomic bomb. Now, this also included a Soviet spy who leaked the plans of the bomb to Russia, so that in 1949, when the Russians detonated their first bomb, it was an exact copy of what had been developed at Los Alamos. They had to test the bomb, and they did so at Trinity. You can visit that site today. Here is the bomb being transported to the test site. They called it the Gadget. A tower was built at the test site to drop and detonate the first atomic bomb. They didn't know what would happen. A huge chain reaction would begin and tremendous energy released. A few of the scientists thought they wouldn't be able to stop the chain reaction, and the atmosphere of the Earth would be torn off the planet and everyone would die. But they really didn't know, even if the bomb would work. July 16th, 1945, produced this result. This is how the Los Alamos scientists reacted to the explosion. Quote, it looked like a flickering bulb. The cloud reached the natural clouds in the dawning sky. The explosion came to our eyes and to our ears with a tremendous wind. The land was dark before, and now it was light, as strong and bright as the sun. Unquote. The scientists held their breath. They yelled. They thought it was awful. They thought it was the end of civilization. Or they thought it was triumphant and beautiful. All of the above. The first bomb blast was equivalent to 20,000 tons of TNT. A radius of 1 mile was vaporized. If dropped in the middle of Manhattan Island, the rubble would be as flat as the Kansas prairie. Today, you can visit in Los Angeles the Nevada Test Ground Museum, and you can see a detailed review with the exhibits of the development of the bomb. You can even sit in a bomb shelter, see the bomb explode, and get the backwash. It is run by biologists, volunteers, who worked at the nuclear test ground site until it closed in the 80s. I was there and talked to them twice. I asked them if you could still see that test ground. And he said, oh yes, once a month, you can get on a school bus and we'll drive you out to the testing site. And I said, well, isn't it dangerous? And he said, no, don't worry about it. Just don't bring a shovel and start digging. Soon thereafter, 2 bombs were built, Fat Man and Little Boy. After that, 1 bomb per month could be manufactured by the United States at that time. Here's a picture of the B-29 Enola Gay that was used to drop the first A-bomb, Little Boy. These are the members of the 303rd Bombardment Squadron, a section of the 509th Air Force that was entrusted to the delivery of the bomb. The pilot, Lieutenant Colonel Tibbett, and Enola Gay was named after his mother. Thin Man, or Little Boy, this narrow uranium bomb weighed 5 tons. They had to strip the aircraft of all its weight because they were afraid they wouldn't be able to take off. It was so heavy. The flight path from Tinian, a white coral rock, to Hiroshima was about 1,500 miles. They were diverted from their first no, they weren't diverted from their, that's Nagasaki, I apologize. On August the 6th, 1945, at 8:15 in the morning, at an altitude of 1,870 feet, 1/2 pound of cordite was driven into the uranium chunk, into each other, and a brilliant purplish white flash lit the sky. 4¼ miles of Hiroshima was flattened, 2/3 of the city destroyed, 59% of all its buildings. Hiroshima had been a major harbor, crammed with oil refineries, workshops, warehouses, armament factories. They all vanished. A population of 343,000, a garrison of 150,000 troops. 78,000 died, another 70,000 were injured. Here is the equivalent of using conventional bombs. Little boy equivalent, 20,000 tons of TNT. The explosion, the temperature became that of the sun. After Hiroshima, the emperor and his staff, his cabinet, considered the Potsdam Declaration by the Allies demanding unconditional surrender. Or they would drop more A-bombs. The Japanese rejected the ultimatum. First, Hiroshima was not an A-bomb. Second, the US had no more A-bombs. Third, international opinion would stop the use of the A-bomb. 2 days later, on August the 8th, the USSR declared war on Japan and invaded Manchuria. Russia had promised to go to war with Japan after defeating Germany. The Japanese had hoped to negotiate through the Russians a better peace treaty. Well, this was dashed. On August 9th, the second A-bomb was dropped on Nagasaki, a port city on the island of Kyushu. This was a secondary target. The first had been closed in because of weather. Fat Man, here it is, was a plutonium bomb, U-235, 10 feet, 8 inches long. It had never been tested before the detonation over Nagasaki. The issue was, did they provide enough plutonium to explode the bomb? Well, they did. 1.5 square miles of Nagasaki was flattened, 74% of all its buildings. The population, 250,000 people, 35,000 people killed, 60,000 people injured. Cut now to the emperor and his palace. Cabinet meeting went deep into the night, August the 9th, 1945. The cabinet became deadlocked. 3 wanted peace, 3 ministers wanted to continue the war. However, by that time, Truman still demanded complete surrender, but he did promise to continue, quote, a constitutional monarchy under the present dynasty, unquote, meaning under Emperor Hirohito. At 2 a.m. in the morning, Emperor Hirohito broke the silence of the throne. What does that mean? Hirohito never addressed his ministers directly. He did it through the court chamberlain. For the first time, he told the cabinet what he was thinking. And this is what he said. I have given serious thought to the situation prevailing at home and abroad, and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean the destruction of Japan as a nation. I cannot bear to see my innocent people suffer anymore. So he ordered them to prepare an imperial order that he would broadcast to the nation. This was unprecedented. Hirohito was a god. The people weren't even allowed to look at him. They had never heard his voice before. Though the emperor was right, the emperor was in grave danger of an army coup. Rebellion was at hand. The younger officers, zealots, did not care about the atomic bomb. Surrender was worse than death. Japan had never lost a war in its history. On August 9th, 1945, at 7:33 a.m., the Japanese Foreign Ministry clicked off a message to Switzerland and Sweden and transmitted that they would accept the surrender terms of the Allies. 5 days later, on the night of August the 14th, troops of the Imperial Japanese Army invaded the palace and its grounds. Their intent was to kidnap the emperor and smash the vinyl record he had made that would have been broadcast to the Japanese nation. Pictured here are the leaders of the coup. Luckily, they failed to find the emperor, who was carefully hidden in the recesses below the palace, or the record. Early in the morning of August the 15th, General Tanaka, the Tokyo Army commander, went to the palace and ordered the troops and these officers out of the palace and ended the rebellion. He then returned to his headquarters and committed suicide. The next day, at 12 o'clock noon, August 15th, the emperor's recorded message was broadcast to the people. Hirohito's decision to make this broadcast was drastic and unprecedented, but it was designed to forestall any attempt by right-wing fanatics and the military to interfere with the termination of the war. Hirohito told his stunned people in part that the war would lead to the total extinction of human civilization, particularly Japan. Therefore, we have resolved to pave the way for a grand peace for all the generations to come by enduring the unendurable and suffering what is unsufferable. September 2nd, 1945, VJ Day. Japan's dreams of empire sat on the bottom of Tokyo Bay. 260 Allied ships, a huge armada, steamed into Tokyo Bay. On the battleship Missouri, the Allies gathered for the final surrender of Japan that would end the Second World War. The officiating general was Douglas MacArthur, who would then be named the head of the Allied government for the occupation of Japan. Ironically, the Japanese sent a former foreign minister who had worked to stop the war in the 1930s. The military had tried to assassinate him. He's the man in the top hat you see with a cane. They blew off his leg. He struggled to climb the rope ladder up the side of the Missouri. So here is the peacenik sent by the emperor to sign the terms of surrender for the nation. MacArthur signed for the US, then General Wainwright, who had surrendered at Bataan, and British General Percival, who had surrendered Singapore. 70,000 British soldiers surrendered, the largest surrender in British history. They both stepped forward and also signed the Allied victory document. The table was a mess table from the captain's cabin. It had stains all over it. But they arranged the surrender documents across the table so that no one could see the coffee stains on the green felt cloth. As the proceedings closed, thousands of carrier planes and B-29s swept over the Missouri. One of the Japanese officers looked up, awestruck. He said, "I wonder how Japan could ever have thought we could defeat this mighty power." After August the 15th, senior Japanese officers overseas still refused to surrender. The emperor had to make a second broadcast for them to surrender. A few isolated units and individuals still ignored it. Across Japan and Asia, thousands of Allied POWs were at last freed from prison camps and slave labor. The death rate for prisoners of war in Germany of Allied prisoners was about 4%. The death rate of Allied prisoners of war with the Japanese was 38%. Well aware of the dangers from fanatics, the emperor took further precautions. He sent out imperial orders issued to the armed forces, ordering them again to lay down their arms. Finally, he had to send members of the imperial family to physically travel overseas to garrisons and force the commanders to comply with the surrender. September 27th, 1945, MacArthur and the emperor met at the beginning of MacArthur's reign as the supreme commander of the occupation. Here is a historic photograph. The emperor had never before been photographed with a commoner. At the beginning of the meeting, the emperor told MacArthur, quote, "I come to you, General MacArthur, to offer myself to the judgment of the powers you represent, as the one to bear sole responsibility for every political and military decision made and action taken by my people in the conduct of the war," unquote. In the end, MacArthur did not prosecute Hirohito as a war criminal. Hirohito was a marine biologist. Hirohito did not order the attack on Pearl Harbor. Hirohito was a figurehead. He certainly supported the war as a Japanese, but he himself did not control the war. This meeting was the first of 9 other meetings that would occur during the occupation between the emperor and MacArthur. A new constitution was made for the Japanese, one of the most liberal guarantees of civil rights, freedom of thought, conscience, academic freedom, the essential equality of the sexes, Social Security, and the right to work. Political parties blossomed for the first time in this parliamentarian form of government. Japan has one of the world's strongest economies today. What about the bomb? A careful study of Japan's decision to surrender notes the alternative to using the bomb. First, continued sinking of all the merchant shipping. Second, a more intensive bombing campaign of the cities, though there was not much left to bomb. On the Asian mainland, the Soviets, of course, had seized 2.7 million Japanese nationals, only 1/3 military. Of this, 370,000 died in Soviet hands. Taking this as a yardstick, the Soviets planned to occupy Hokkaido. Another 400,000 Japanese probably would have died. The notion that conventional air and sea power without an invasion or the use of the bomb would have forced the Japanese to surrender is probably difficult to prove or disprove. Yet it is hard to see how a continuous bombardment of Japan would have led the Japanese military to surrender. It's unclear that without the bomb, the emperor would have intervened and provided the first essential step to that process. Without a capitulation, it is not clear whether the war would have ended in 1946 or even 1947. As we have seen with Hirohito's support in 2 atomic bomb attacks, the Japanese acceptance of surrender at best was very weak and almost was scuttled at the 11th hour. In 2020, on the 75th anniversary that we have just had of the atomic bomb, the Prime Minister of Japan offered no apology for the Japanese aggressions of World War II. The Emperor did, the current Emperor. The atomic bombs, which ended the war against Japan, did not cause as much material damage or as many casualties as the gigantic incendiary bomb attacks that had killed 130,000 people across Japan. Other raids on cities such as Osaka and Kobe had also caused over 300,000 deaths. Of course, all the Allied prisoners of war would be murdered in cold blood. The massacres had already been arranged, where they would burn the bodies or finish off people with machine guns. There's another perspective as well. What about the American infantrymen and Marines preparing for the assault? As one 21-year-old lieutenant who had been in Europe and was now traveling to Japan said, he cried with relief and joy at hearing the atomic bomb had ended the war. He said, quote, "We are going to live. We are going to grow up to adulthood after all." If the US had invaded Japan, the operation would have been prolonged and protracted. It would have probably ended the war maybe in 1947. The American public was very anxious to have its husbands and sons and loved ones returned. General Marshall, the Army Chief of Staff, remarked, quote, "The American people don't want to fight a 7 years war." The Soviet Union that had declared war was preparing to invade Japan and would have been part of the occupation of Japan. Maybe we would have had a Berlin Wall in Tokyo, and the people of North Japan would have suffered for decades, like the people of East Germany and now still North Korea. By surrendering, when they did, the Japanese saved the lives of many of their citizens and soldiers who would have been killed. Operation Downfall's invasion would have resulted in horrendous slaughter. The Japanese, what do they think? In a recent program of this, what you've just seen, I spoke with a Japanese woman who was 15 years old and lived in a suburb of Hiroshima and saw the devastation. After reviewing the facts, she said to all of us during this broadcast that considering this information, that there were two bad alternatives, and the worst alternative would have been the invasion, because the Japanese people would have been completely annihilated from the face of the earth. Secretary Simpson said the same thing. He said using nuclear weapons was the least abhorrent choice to end the war. The atomic bomb was awful, but the alternative was worse. In 1995, on the 50th anniversary of the dropping of these bombs, the U.S. scrapped plans to issue a commemorative stamp on the use of the A-bomb to end World War II. Let us be very plain, speaking of war. The firebombing of Hamburg, Dresden, the bombing of London, and all the cities of Europe by the Germans, our firebombing of Japan. These are immoral and inhuman acts. The United States was not the aggressor in the Second World War, nor were the other countries of Europe. They were attempting to defend themselves and end war. War is legalized killing. Many men who come home then face combat syndrome and have a hard time adjusting, become alcoholics, suffer from a variety of emotional distress. War is an immoral act of civilization. It becomes necessary in defense at times. But Since then, there have been more than 2,500 nuclear explosions, test explosions. No nuclear bomb has been used in combat since those two events in Japan. However, there are 15,000 warheads now in existence. This is the lesson of history that we must ponder daily. Our civilization hangs on the slender thread of mutually assured destruction. That awesome fear has kept the nuclear genie in its bottle and prevented the gross immorality of a total devastating atomic war. Our daily vigilance must remain strong to prevent a nuclear catastrophe that would end civilization as we know it. And I think that is the most important lesson we can take from this 75th anniversary. So now let's get to some questions.
Okay, if people have questions, could you please type them into the chat? That way we won't be talking over each other.
No, that's wrong. Oh dear, no, stop. There we go.
There
All right,
we
there
go.
we are. All right,
Edward, you said
yes.
Los Angeles rather than Las Vegas.
Las Vegas, I'm sorry.
For the test museum.
The test museum is in Las Vegas, not Los Angeles. That's why my wife is sitting here. She has a long checklist here, folks.
All right.
Also, too, she's heard this speech so many times, I think she's falling asleep.
She could probably give it herself.
Well, that's a possibility. Maybe she should next time. So what, do we have questions?
If you have questions, again, please type them into the chat. And that way we won't be talking over each other.
The Japanese recently are trying to amend their constitution so that they can have missiles to defend themselves, as the United States seems to be withdrawing from parts of Asia and Europe. The Japanese are afraid of communist China and of North Korea, which are, of course, very close. And of course, remember, the Koreans were a colony of Japan for a long time, and many Koreans died in World War II in the service of the Japanese Army.
Okay, there is a question in chat from Peggy. She says, you mentioned fires in the Pacific Northwest. Was that actually US territory?
Yes, this is Washington State, mainly, and Oregon. That's where these fires occurred. And they were very bad, and that information was kept from the public because they didn't want the Japanese to realize how effective those fire bombs were. So the Japanese stopped that, and they switched to the botulism I mentioned. And that failed, thank God, because of it being frozen at high altitude.
Okay, it's like Deirdre started to write a question. Deirdre?
Deidre is working on a question.
She started to write, it's like, was it fear of the, but there's nothing after.
Why didn't you, oh, what's this?
Okay, now here's one from Anne. It was an interesting presentation. Hard to believe the destruction. Was there such polarization among US citizens as we experience today?
No, there was not. Some of the scientists didn't want to drop the bomb. And afterwards, Oppenheimer tried to prevent the United States from deploying nuclear weapons. And he was criticized by, as you can imagine, by the military, since he had developed the bomb. Once the Soviets exploded their bomb, that even heightened the fears more. And of course, if you remember, during the 1960s, when President Kennedy started telling all of us to dig air raid shelters in our backyards, if you remember that, there was the book America in Hiding was written. I had a copy of it. I read it. I don't have a copy of it anymore, but it caused a great deal of fear in our country, and it caused the proliferation of crooked contractors building shelters that if you got in and closed the door, you'd suffocate because there was absolutely no ventilation. So that wouldn't have worked too well. All right, Deidre, do we have Deidre's question? Why don't you let
Unmute
Deidre?
Deirdre.
Go ahead. Unmute Deidre.
I'm confident at this. Was fear by the Japanese of the Russians important?
Yes. I think that also was a factor. There were two factions in the Japanese military. One wanted to invade Siberia and get all of the oil and gold and raw materials that they needed for their war machine. The other faction wanted to invade the Dutch East Indies and get the oil that they needed from that. So in 1937, the Japanese attacked Siberia. They had an incident, and General Zhukov, the man who would take Berlin, and that may be my next program for you guys, Hitler's downfall, because it's the 75th anniversary of that. Zhukov fought the Japanese. The Japanese lost 60,000 men. And that ended the idea of attacking the Russians. The Russians made mincemeat out of them. And some of those Japanese ended up in slave labor camps in Siberia. And then ended up in the Russian army fighting the Germans. And then they were captured by the Germans and put in slave labor. And then they were volunteered and fought in the German army. And they were in Normandy as support troops and captured by the 82nd Airborne and we interviewed them. And they said, "Who are you? Where did you come from?" And they recorded this crazy odyssey. There's a Japanese-Russian movie, My Way. It's a crazy movie, but if you can get a copy of it, watch it, because it talks about this odyssey of these poor Koreans. And Korea, as I said, was a colony of Japan, terribly mistreated during the war. Many of the comfort women, forced prostitution for the Japanese came from Korea, North and South.
Joan?
Yes, go. Hi, Bill.
Yeah,
I just had a question.
In and out on us.
Yeah.
What's your
I just
question?
had a question, Ed, about the historical reflection on this decision. It took many years, several decades, before serious revisionist histories as to the necessity of using the bomb began to appear. It's always seemed to me that the argument which you looked at this evening is really overwhelming in terms of the lack of any other alternative. But I wondered, you're closer to the revisionist history, the current modern histories that are being written that go back and look at this. Has there been any progress for the revisionists that the U.S. was, of course, immoral and murdered people needlessly in pursuit of their typically monetary objectives?
Well, I would say that in the closest argument that has been successful was the bombing of Dresden, Germany, that also was a firebomb that killed many people. And the chief reason that occurred was they had run out of cities to bomb. And that was one of the few intact cities left, and they bombed it. And Bomber Harris, who was the British commander-in-chief of their bomber command, had insisted throughout the whole war that they could defeat Germany just by bombing them, by area-wide terror bombing, that would succeed. Now, the Germans tried the same tactic on England on a smaller scale, that they would use terror bombing, and that would crack British morale and force Churchill to surrender. The research is very clear that it does not work. Terror bombing does not work to crack the morale. In fact, if anything, it hardens the morale of people to resist. whether they're Japanese, Brits, or Germans. That's one reason why people say, look at Germany. My God, the thing was a wasteland, like Japan. Yes, but the Germans didn't surrender, did they? They should have. Hitler should have surrendered, but he was afraid, of course, he would stand on trial and be hanged. So he fought to the end and then killed himself. That's next month if we do the Battle of Berlin. But now the revisionist history, yes, it was immoral to drop the atomic bomb, but it was also immoral to kill how many people in the firebombing beforehand. And as this Japanese woman, 90-year-old, just said, now that she sees all the facts and statistics laid out in cold ink here, she saw it, Japan would have been destroyed, literally wiped off the face of the earth. And that would have been even worse. Instead, we built it up as a major nation again. It's prosperous, it's free, it's democratic. So, no, I do not think that the revisionist historians, if they look at the whole picture, have a case. Again, it's a factor of historical presentism. You use today's values and project it back to 1945. It doesn't wash. It doesn't work.
Thank
And
you.
I think, you know, that's what I think really where the argument stands now. Other questions? Sorry, there were no funny stories. Well, very little in this program. This was a real tragedy. But remember, it was the Japanese military during the 20s and the 30s that put Japan in this position to fight this war. Japanese imperialism, Asia for Asians, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that they talked about. And they occupied all of these other countries. Their occupation was far worse than anything the British or the Dutch or anyone else had ever done to the Chinese, the Malays, the Filipinos, the people in Dutch East India now that is Indonesia. The Japanese were brutal occupiers. They considered themselves racially superior to everyone, just like the Germans, but not because they had Aryan blood, but because they were Japanese. Let us hope that we never see anything like this again in Asia. I pray
Well,
to
that
God.
was terrific, Ed. Thanks very much.
Oh, you're welcome.
Here,
Well,
here.
thank you.
Thank you so much, Ed. We so much appreciate your doing this on what's become a regular basis. It's been tremendously helpful and connecting us at this weird
Well,
time.
now, I want my wife, well, she doesn't want to appear on camera
Oh,
here,
okay.
but she did the slides, folks. Let's give some credit to
You're
her.
here.
All right.
You're here. I'm
Exactly.
going to applaud her. See,
So
we can
behind
all-
every man is a more intelligent woman. Remember that.
I've no doubt.
And thank you all for coming tonight. And if the club wants it, we'll do another program next month.
We'll definitely talk about.
Oh,
Thank
and by
you,
the
Ed.
way, I do want to mention to all the cliff dwellers that we still need to raise another $40,000 this month to meet our goal of $250,000 for the year. And my wife and I are seriously considering pledging some more money so we can meet that goal. And we are planning a appreciation party in September that our dear president is we're trying to figure out how we can do this with a small number of people and not all be thrown in jail for violating the law or get COVID-19. And no, I don't intend to do that either. But we want to thank all of you who have contributed to the 21st Century Fund. And good night. And
Good night,
I hope to
Andy.
see you soon at the club. Please come
Yes,
to the
come
club.
have
I was
dinner,
there
come have
today. We need you to come to the club for lunch.
Right.
And those of you
Thank you
in
all for
Philadelphia,
coming.
thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Okay. All right.
Thank
Good night.
you all.
Thanks very much.